He saw her before he saw the man she was talking to, which was how it always worked with Vivian Carr. She was the thing in the room his attention found first, before he had consciously directed it anywhere. She was standing near the east corridor of the Aldrich event space, a glass of water in her hand that she had not been drinking, and the man in front of her was positioned in the way of a person who had closed the distance between them down to a number smaller than conversation required, and had not moved back when the conversation gave him reason to. Noel Caine had been at the west end of the same corridor 40 seconds earlier, finishing a sentence with the head of the Meridian Group's legal team, and he had crossed the space between them not because he had been summoned, not because Vivian had looked at him, but because the angle of her shoulders and the placement of her feet told him everything. Her face, turned away from him, could not, and the everything was sufficient. He said something brief to the legal team head and moved. He had worked with Vivian for 2 years. In those 2 years he had learned to read the specific grammar of her physical composure, the difference between the stillness she deployed in rooms where everything was going correctly and the stillness she deployed in rooms where she was managing something that was not correct and had decided not to let it show. This was the second kind. Her weight was distributed toward her left foot, which meant her right foot was angled toward the nearest exit she had already identified. Her glass was held at a height that could function as a barrier or could be raised to create a moment of movement. She was not afraid. She was contained, and the container was working harder than it should have to at a professional event on a Tuesday evening in November. He crossed the corridor and arrived beside her before the man in front of her had registered his approach, and he put his hand on the small of her back with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times and had not, and he said to the man, "I did not know you two were acquainted. Vivian is my wife." The word landed in the corridor the way accurate information landed when it was also unexpected. Not like a blow, but like a rearrangement. The other person's understanding of the situation, shifting to accommodate a new load-bearing element. The man, who was somewhere in his early 30s, broad across the shoulders, with the specific quality of a person who was accustomed to being the largest presence in a social situation, looked at Noel and then at Vivian and then at Noel again, and the recalibration was visible in his face, even if he was trying to prevent it from being. He said, "I was not aware Noel Caine had a wife." He said it to Vivian, not to Noel, which told Noel several things at once. Vivian said, "It has not been widely announced." Her voice was even in the way it was, even when she was deciding how much information to provide in an exchange she did not want to be having, and she said it with a tone that closed conversations rather than opened them, and the man, after a moment that had the quality of something being weighed and found insufficient, said something general and moved away toward the bar. Noel did not watch him go. He watched Vivian. She waited until the man was out of the range where the conversation they were about to have could be overheard, which he estimated at approximately 12 feet and which she estimated at 15, because she was more careful than he was about these things, and he had come to rely on her calibration. Then she looked at him, which was the first time she had looked directly at him since he arrived beside her, and the look contained several things he recognized from 2 years of receiving it. Assessment, calculation, and the specific quality she reserved for moments when he had done something she had not expected and had not yet determined whether it was useful. She said, "Why did you do that?" Her voice was entirely level. He said, "Because it was the fastest solution." She said, "You could have said I was your colleague." He said, "Colleague does not carry the same weight." She looked at him for a moment in the way she looked at things she was deciding how to file. Then she said, "All right," and turned to scan the room with the expression she wore when she was returning to work, and he removed his hand from her back with the same ease with which he had placed it there, and they went back to the event. The event ran another 90 minutes, which was the scheduled length, and which both of them honored, because the event was something Vivian had been coordinating logistics for over the preceding 3 weeks, and walking out of it early would have been a failure of the work rather than the evening. They moved through the space in the way they had learned to move through professional events, separately, but with a shared awareness of each other's location. which was a habit they had developed for operational reasons and which had, over 2 years, become something more like instinct than procedure. Noel noticed that the man from the corridor did not approach Vivian again. He also noticed, when he crossed within 10 feet of the man once, that the man watched him with the specific attention of someone who was revising their understanding of a situation and was not entirely satisfied with the revision. He filed this and continued with the evening. He introduced Vivian as his wife to 3 people before he made the deliberate decision to stop doing it, because 3 was the number that established the story, and also the number after which continuing would have begun to look like emphasis rather than fact, and emphasis was something he avoided in situations he wanted to settle rather than escalate. On the way back, in the car, they were quiet for the length of time it took to clear the parking structure and enter the main road, which was Vivian's version of a cooling period, the time she allowed between a thing happening and the conversation about it. He had learned this in the first 6 months. He respected it. Then she said, "How long had you been watching before you came over?" He said, "Long enough." She said, "That is not a measurement." He said, 40 seconds, approximately." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was not going to do anything. Not in that room." He said, "I know." She said, "Then you did not come over because I was in danger." He said, "No." She absorbed this. He said, "How long have you been avoiding him at events?" She looked at the window. She said, 3 months. He said, "You should have told me." She said, "It was not your problem to manage." He said, "Vivian." She said, "I handled it." He said, "You have been rearranging your attendance schedule for 3 months to avoid a situation that resolved in 40 seconds. She said, "It resolved because you said something that is not true." He said, "It resolved." She looked at the city going past the window and did not answer, and he did not push further, and the car moved through the November night, and neither of them said anything else, and the silence between them was not the comfortable kind, but it was not the hostile kind either. It was the kind that happened when something true had been said and had not yet been decided what to do with. She was at her desk by 7:50, which was 10 minutes earlier than usual, which she had not planned but which had happened because she had woken at 6 and spent the subsequent hour and 15 minutes lying in the specific way of a person who has decided not to think about something and is spending considerable cognitive energy in forcing that decision. The office was quiet in the way it was quiet in the window between when the cleaning crew finished and when the first of the administrative staff arrived, and she set her coffee down and opened her laptop and pulled up the event debrief template she had been planning to complete this morning, and she had been working for 11 minutes when her phone showed a notification from a professional networking platform. She looked at it. Someone she did not know had tagged the Caine organization account in a post. The post contained a photograph. She looked at the photograph for a moment, and then she set the phone down and looked at the wall for a moment, and then she picked the phone up again. The photograph had been taken at the Aldrich event space at approximately 9:40 the previous evening, from an angle that suggested the photographer had been standing near the east corridor entrance. It showed a man's hand on a woman's back. The man was recognizable. The woman was also recognizable. The caption read, "Spotted. Noel Caine at the Meridian networking event. Not alone." There were 14 comments, and it had been shared 6 times, and it had been posted at 11:17 the previous evening, and it was now 8:01 in the morning. She was reading the comments when Noel came in, which was early for him, and she looked up from her phone and he looked at hers and said, "How long?" She said, "It went up at 11:17 last night. 6 shares and 14 comments as of this moment." He said, "Which platforms?" She told him. He nodded once and went to his office, and she heard him on the phone within 30 seconds, the particular register of his voice that she had categorized early in their working relationship as the voice he used for conversations that required the other party to pay attention before they spoke. She went back to her screen and began tracking the spread of the image through the professional network channels she monitored for the organization, which was part of her job and which had the useful quality of giving her something specific and measurable to do with the next 14 minutes. His door opened at 8:29. He said her name in the particular way he said it when he was summoning her to a conversation rather than making a request, and she picked up her notebook and her pen and went in and sat in the chair she always sat in and looked at him across the desk. He said, "The legal team has flagged an exposure issue." She said, "The image." He said, "The image is not the issue. The claim is the issue." When a claim of that nature is made in a professional context and then not clarified, it accrues a legal character over time that creates complications, specifically around representation and authority. She said, "You are telling me that saying I was your wife creates a legal fiction that becomes harder to correct the longer it is not corrected." He said, "That is one way to characterize it." She said, "What is your way?" He said, "I am telling you that the simplest way to resolve this is to not resolve it." She looked at him across the desk for a long moment. She said, "You are asking me to continue the claim." He said, "I am asking you to not contradict it for a defined period in a limited set of contexts. The image has already been seen by everyone who was going to see it. Correcting it now creates a story. Not correcting it allows the story to become ordinary." She said, "You are asking me to lie." He said, "I am asking you to maintain a position I already created." She said, "Those are the same thing." He said, "In practice, the difference is that one of them is already done." She looked at the notebook in her lap, which she had not opened. She thought about the man in the corridor whose name she had not said to Noel last night, and the 3 months of adjusted event attendance, and the specific calculation she had made each of those times, which was that managing the situation herself was less costly than introducing it as a variable into the organizational environment. She thought about whether that calculation had been correct, and concluded that it had been correct in the short term and had produced an incorrect long-term outcome, which was the failure mode of that particular approach when applied to situations that did not stay short-term. She said, "I have conditions." He said, "Tell me." She said, "My role does not change. My responsibilities, my reporting structure, my day-to-day function, unchanged." He said, "Agreed." She said, "No public statements referencing the claim are made without me present and without my prior agreement." He said, "Agreed." She said, "A defined duration, no longer than 90 days, after which we reassess." He said, 60 days. After 60 days, the story is either established or it is not, and 90 provides a longer window for complication than is necessary. She considered this. She said, 60 days. He said, "Agreed." She said, "In writing." He looked at her with the expression she had learned to read as the expression he produced when something she said was so consistent with how she operated that he did not need to adjust for it. He said, "I will have it drafted by this afternoon." She nodded and stood and was almost to the door when he said, "Who is he?" She turned. He said, "The man from last night. You know him." She said, "Yes." He said, "For how long?" She said, "Long enough." He looked at her with a specific quality of attention he applied to information he intended to act on later. She said, "He is not your problem to manage," and used his words from the car deliberately, and left before he could decide whether to find that fair or insufferable. She was back at her desk for 9 minutes before her phone showed a text message from a number she had saved under the letter D and had not deleted, because deleting it would have required opening the contact, and she had found it easier to leave it there and manage her response to it whenever it appeared. The message read, "So he doesn't know about us, about what we were. Interesting." She read it. She set the phone down. She opened her event tracking document and updated the share count, which had reached 11. She read the message again. She did not reply. She thought about what the word interesting meant in the context of a person who operated the way Daniel Marsh operated, which was that interesting was not an observation but a door being tested a preliminary assessment of whether a leverage point existed and was accessible. She thought about this for the duration of 2 more sips of coffee, and then she opened the email draft she had been composing for the last 3 weeks in the folder she had labeled Q4 Logistics, which contained no logistics, and she read through it once, and she saved it without sending it and closed the folder because 60 days was enough time for many things to change, and she had learned from the previous 3 months that the cost of a decision made before a situation was fully visible was always higher than the cost of waiting until it was. A week passed in the way that weeks passed when you were maintaining something that required ongoing management, attentively, with a specific quality of attention that was different from ordinary work attention, because ordinary work attention could be set down at the end of the day, and this could not. Vivian tracked 3 things simultaneously during that week: the professional network image, which had settled at 41 shares and stopped spreading on day 3, the 60-day agreement, which she had signed and which was filed in a folder she did not label ambiguously, and the text message from the letter D, which she had not answered, and which had not been followed by another, which was either a good sign or a sign that Daniel Marsh had moved his leverage attempt to a different channel. On day 5 of the week, she had begun checking the professional network profiles of the people she knew Daniel was connected to, which was the kind of monitoring she did not tell anyone she was doing because it was the kind of monitoring that required explaining, and explaining required describing the situation in full, and describing the situation in full required saying the name and the history and the reason it mattered, which she was not yet ready to do. She had found nothing alarming on day 5. She checked again on day 7 and found the same nothing, which she filed as a neutral data point rather than a positive one. The second event was on a Thursday. It was a smaller gathering than the Aldrich event, a dinner hosted by the Meridian Group's chairman at a restaurant that seated 40 at private tables, which meant there was less room to manage distance and more pressure on conversation. Vivian arrived with Noel, which was different from the previous event where she had arrived ahead of him for logistics setup, and the difference was visible in the way people greeted them. Together, with the paired acknowledgement that the image on the professional network had established as the correct mode of reception. She had prepared for this. She was good at preparation. She was less good at the specific texture of standing beside Noel Caine at a dinner table while he made conversation, and she made conversation adjacent to his conversation, and the aggregate of it looked, from the outside, exactly like what they had said it was, which was the point, and which was also the part that was harder to prepare for than she had anticipated. The physical closeness that had been contextually appropriate for 2 years in office settings carried a different weight in a social setting where the context was not professional but personal, and she was doing the work of adjusting to that weight in real time, while also tracking the room for the variable she had not told Noel about. Richard Marsh was seated 2 tables away. She had known he would be here because she had the seating chart, which was her job, and she had looked at his name on the chart and made no visible response and filed the information in the same folder as the 60-day agreement and the monitoring results. When he rose from his table during the cocktail hour and crossed the room toward them, she had approximately 8 seconds to decide whether to intercept or to allow, and she allowed, because intercepting would have required a reason, and reasons in this context required explanations. Richard Marsh was in his early 60s, a man who had the quality of someone whose authority had been so consistently confirmed over a long period that he no longer thought about it. The authority simply was, like gravity. He shook Noel's hand and said the things one said in this context, and then he turned to Vivian and said, "I had no idea Noel was married. This must be quite recent." He said it with the warm directness of a man who asked questions because he genuinely wanted to know and did not consider this intrusive. Vivian said, "Recent enough that we are still adjusting to people knowing," which was not untrue, and which directed the conversation away from specifics without appearing to. Richard smiled and said something about how his own wife had taken 3 months to inform anyone and moved back to Noel, and Vivian watched him go and thought, "He does not know. Daniel has not told him." And then she thought, "Why not?" She was still carrying that question when Daniel appeared in the corridor outside the private dining area, which was where she had gone at minute 40 of the dinner to check on the logistics for dessert service, because she had organized this dinner and the tasks did not stop, because she was also performing a different role in the same room. He was standing at the corridor entrance with the ease of a person who had positioned himself there with intention, not waiting but placed, and he said, "You are very good at this." She said, "At what?" He said, "At making things look like what they are not." She said, "I am at work." He said, "Convenient framing." She looked at him with the assessment she had learned to conduct without letting it show, the evaluation of what someone wanted from an interaction before she decided how much of herself to put into it. He said, "Does he know you were with me for 2 years? Does he know what it was and why it ended?" She said, "That is not his business." He said, "Does he know the reason we ended was because I found out what you were actually doing with your time? Or does he think you are the version of yourself you show him?" She said, "You found out what I was doing, which was my job, and you did not like that my job was more important to me than managing your feelings about my job." He said, "He will not like it either." She said, "You do not know him." He said, "You do not know him. You do not know. You do not know." He said, "I know men like him. And I know that when his business partner finds out that his wife has a habit of leaving when things become inconvenient, it will not help the deal he is currently trying to close with my father." The word father landed in the corridor with the weight she had been waiting for it to land with for the past week, the weight of a thing finally being said that had been hovering unsaid for longer than it should have. She said, "Good night, Daniel," and went back into the dinner, and her face was entirely neutral when she sat back down beside Noel. She waited until they were in the car. She did not use the cooling period. She said, "Daniel Marsh is Richard Marsh's son." Noel looked at her. She said, "I knew before tonight. I knew before the event last week. I did not tell you because I did not want you to address it through the organization instead of through me." He was quiet for a moment, the thinking quiet. She said, "He told me tonight that he would tell his father the marriage is not real. He used your deal as leverage." Noel said, "What did you say to him?" She said, "Krura, one summer, talked it. I said good night and walked away." He was quiet again, and she sat with the specific discomfort of having said the thing she had not said, and waiting to find out what the saying of it produced. He said, "You were managing me." She said, "I was managing the situation." He said, "Those are the same thing in this case." She did not answer immediately, because he was right, and she knew he was right, and she had known he was right, since the moment in the first week when she had looked at Daniel's name on the Marsh account file and chosen not to mention it. She said, "I was afraid you would handle it in a way that made it worse." He said, "Worse for whom?" She said, "For me." He said nothing for a long time. The car moved through the city in the November dark, and the silence had a different quality now than the silence from the previous week. That one had been about a thing said and not yet understood, and this one was about a thing understood and not yet forgiven, and she was not certain which one was harder to sit in. The email from Richard Marsh arrived at 9:14 on a Friday morning, addressed to the Caine organization's general correspondence account with a copy to Noel's direct line, which meant Richard had wanted it documented and had wanted it seen. Vivian saw it before Noel did because she filtered the general account, and she read it twice with the specific efficiency of a person extracting information from a document before forming a response to it. The email was 4 sentences long. It said that the Marsh Group had decided to explore other partnerships at this time. It said that Richard valued the relationship and hoped they could revisit in the future. It said nothing about Daniel, and nothing about marriages, and nothing about the dinner on Thursday, which was how people said everything while appearing to say nothing, a technique Vivian recognized because she had been applying it herself for 2 weeks. She forwarded it to Noel's inbox with no note attached, because the document was sufficient, and notes were for situations that required interpretation, and this one did not. Noel came in at 9:43, and she could tell from the quality of his entry that he had read the email. He went to his office, and she gave him 11 minutes, and then she went in and closed the door and sat down. He was looking at the window, not at her, which meant he was arranging something rather than processing it. And she waited. He said, "Daniel went to his father." She said, "Yes." He said, "Richard does not have the full picture. He has enough to withdraw on character grounds without specifying what the character grounds are, which keeps the withdrawal clean for him." She said, "That was Daniel's calculation." He said, "It was a good calculation." She said, "Yes." He looked at her then, and she looked back, and the thing between them had the quality of two people who had each been operating from partial information and were now looking at the same full picture for the first time. He said, "I am going to see Richard." She said, "When?" He said, "This afternoon." She said, "What are you going to tell him?" He said, "The truth." She said, "Which version?" He said, "The version that closes the deal," and stood up and put on his jacket, and she watched him move with the specific intention she had catalogued 2 years ago in the first week as the movement of a man who had decided what he was going to do and was now in the execution phase, and she thought, "He is going to tell Richard the marriage is real, which will make Richard reconsider, and he is going to do this without asking me, which is what I did to him, and I do not know whether that makes it fair or whether it makes us both wrong in the same direction." He paused at the door. He said, "Clear my 4 o'clock." She said, "Already done," because she had done it while he was arranging at the window, which was the kind of thing she had done for 2 years that had always looked like excellent professional instinct and was also, she was now understanding, a way of making herself indispensable without making herself present. He was gone for 2 hours and 14 minutes. She tracked this, not intentionally, but because she tracked his schedule as a matter of course, and the gap between his departure and his return was a variable that registered automatically. When he came back, she was at her desk completing a contract review, and she looked up and he crossed to her desk and set a document on the surface in front of her without speaking. She looked at it. It was a single page, formatted in the style of the organization's legal templates, and it took her 4 seconds to understand what it was, and another 3 seconds to understand what had happened and in what order. It was a marriage registration certificate. It was dated today. Her name was on it. His name was on it. Both signatures were present. She looked at her signature for a long moment, and then she looked at the area below the certificate that noted the authorization documentation, and she looked at the NDA addendum file number that was cited as the basis for her signature, and she looked at Noel Caine standing on the other side of her desk with the expression of a man who had done something and was waiting to be told what the doing of it cost. She said, "You told me the NDA addendum was a non-disclosure agreement for the Marsh account." He said, "I told you it was an addendum for the Marsh account." She said, "You allowed me to infer that it was a non-disclosure agreement." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you brought this to Richard today?" He said, "Yes." She said, "And Richard is back in the deal?" He said, "Yes." She set the document down with the particular care of a person who is not going to make a physical demonstration of an emotional state because physical demonstrations of emotional states were not things she did, and she looked at him and said, "You married me without my knowledge." He said, "I married you with your signature." She said, "Obtained under false representation of what I was signing." He said, "Yes." He did not add anything to that. She looked at him and thought about 3 months of rearranging event attendance and 2 weeks of the 60-day agreement and the decision she had made in the car after the second event not to tell him about Daniel until she had determined the correct moment, and she thought about the email in the Q4 logistics folder that she had not sent because she had decided the timing was not right, and she thought about the word interesting and the way Richard had looked when Noel set the certificate on his desk, or the way she imagined Richard had looked, because she had not been in that room, which was the other thing, which was that Noel had gone to Richard and made a decision that affected the central claim of her professional and personal situation without including her in the room where it happened. She said, "We are exactly the same kind of wrong." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." She said, "You managed me the way I managed you." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you know how it felt to be managed?" He said, "I do now." She said, "That is not the same as knowing it before you did it." He said, "No, it is not." He sat down in the chair across from her desk, which was the chair she sat in when she went to his office, and the reversal of that arrangement had a quality she noticed and did not remark on. He said, "Ask me why I went to Richard today without telling you first." She said, "I know why." He said, "Tell me." She said, "Because if you had told me, I would have found a different way to handle it, a way that did not require you to be in that room making that particular claim." He said, "Yes." She said, "Because I have been doing that the entire time, finding ways to handle things that do not require you to be in the room." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you have been watching me do that and not saying anything." He said, "Yes." She said, "For how long?" He said, "Since approximately the second month." She looked at him across the desk and thought about the specific irony of spending 2 years being extremely good at managing a professional environment and having spent those same 2 years being managed in return by the person she was managing for, both of them circling the same information from different angles and neither of them walking through the door. She said, "We have wasted a considerable amount of time." He said, "We have." She said, "I am very angry with you." He said, "I know." She said, "I am also aware that you are going to be very angry with me when you finish being satisfied with the Richard resolution." He said, "I am already both." She said, "That is efficient." He said, "I learned from watching you." She looked at the certificate on her desk and at the man across the desk and at the 2 years of accumulated evidence that they had been conducting parallel operations in the same space with the same blind spot, and she thought, the correct response to this is not a speech and not a concession and not a document, and she thought, I have been this person for my entire adult life, the person who manages from a distance and calls it professionalism, and the distance has been the cost, and I have been paying it so long I stopped noticing what it was buying me, and the answer is not nothing, but it is also not enough. 3 weeks passed. Richard Marsh signed the revised partnership agreement on day 4. Daniel Marsh resigned from his father's company on day 9, which she learned not from Noel but from the professional network she continued to monitor because some habits of information management were too deeply structural to dissolve in a week, and she was not certain she wanted to dissolve them entirely, only to aim them differently. The 60-day agreement was still technically in force, which meant the situation they had agreed to maintain was still being maintained, except that maintenance had become a different kind of work from what it had been in the first 2 weeks. In the first 2 weeks, she had been performing a claim. In the weeks after the Friday of the certificate, she was not certain what she was doing, which was unusual because she was generally certain of what she was doing and had structured her professional life to ensure that certainty remained accessible. Noel had not raised the subject of the certificate again. She had not raised it either. They had gone back to work in the way that people went back to work after something significant had shifted in the environment they were working in, thoroughly, and without acknowledging that the environment was different from what it had been, which was either maturity or avoidance, and she was not yet certain which. On the 22nd day, she went to the office supply room and took out a legal pad and a pen, which were objects she preferred to digital drafting for the work she did before she knew what she was producing, and she sat at the small table in the supply room because it was empty at this hour, and it was not her desk, which was important for reasons she did not examine too closely. She wrote for 40 minutes. What she produced was organized, precise, and covered 4 pages of the legal pad in the handwriting she had developed in law school before she had decided that law was a way of managing systems, and what she actually wanted to do was manage the people who managed systems. She read through what she had written twice and made 3 revisions, and then she transcribed it to a document template on her laptop and spent another 20 minutes on formatting. And then she printed one copy. She put the printed copy in a folder that she labeled with her own name and his name and today's date. And she went back to her desk. She brought it to him after the 4 o'clock call, which was the last scheduled item of his day, and she sat in the chair across from his desk and set the folder on the surface between them and said, "Since we did not negotiate the entrance terms, I thought we should negotiate the exit terms properly." He looked at the folder without opening it. He said, "Is that what this is?" She said, "It is a draft. The terms are reasonable. I reviewed current precedent for agreements of this nature, and I believe the document is fair to both parties." He said, "You drafted your own divorce agreement." She said, "I drafted a dissolution framework. Divorce requires a filing, and we have not discussed whether either of us intends to file." He said, "We have not discussed most of this." She said, "No." He said, "Including whether either of us wants to." She looked at the folder on the desk between them. She said, "I am aware that what I am presenting creates the impression of a decision I have made. I want to be clear that this is a document I produced because producing documents is how I process things that I have not yet decided." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "That is the first answer you have given me in 3 weeks that was not pre-edited." She said, "I know." He said, "I prefer those." She said, "You told me that before." He said, "I will continue to tell you until it changes your output rate." She looked at him across the desk with the legal pad draft in the folder between them and thought, "This is the version of this conversation I did not plan for, the one where he is looking at me like this, and I do not have the correct professional category for what that is." He said, "Ask me something you have not asked me." She said, "That is a broad instruction." He said, "You have a list. You have always had a list. I have watched you not ask it for 2 years." She said, "That is an unsettling thing to know someone has observed." He said, "Less unsettling than the alternative." She said, "Which is?" He said, "That I had not noticed." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The night at the Aldrich event, before you came over, you said 40 seconds. He said, "Yes." She said, "What were you doing for the first 30? He said, "Reading the room." She said, "You were reading me." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you knew?" He said, "I knew enough." She said, "Enough to cross the room." He said, "Enough to not need any other reason." She looked at him and thought about 3 weeks ago and 3 months before that, and the 2 years of professional of exactitude she had wrapped around the thing she was now sitting across the desk from, and she thought, "I have spent 2 years making sure I was useful, and 0 time making sure I was present, and usefulness without presence is just a very elaborate way of keeping yourself at a distance from the thing you are afraid of. And the thing I have been afraid of is this, the actual conversation with no document between us, and no role to step back into when it gets to be too much. And I am in it now, which means the distance has already closed, and the question is only what I do with that." She reached across the desk and picked up the folder and held it in both hands and said, "I am not ready to file this." He said, "I know." She said, "I am also not certain that I want to." He said, "I am not uncertain about that." She said, "You are not uncertain about anything." He said, "I am uncertain about the correct way to tell you things without you deciding in advance whether I need to tell them to you." She said, "That is going to require some adjustment on my part." He said, "I am aware. I have a 60-day timeline on the adjustment." She said, "The 60 days are for the other thing." He said, "I'm done 20T, done 2014. The 60 days are no longer the binding document in this conversation." She set the folder on the arm of the chair and looked at him across the desk and said, "No, they are not." 4 months after the 22nd day, Vivian Carr was still technically the primary assistant of Noel Caine because the structural reality of her role had not changed and the work still required doing, and she was still the person best suited to doing it. which was a fact that existed entirely independently of everything else that was also true, and she had made peace with the coexistence of those facts. The organizational chart still showed her in the same box it had always shown her in. The dissolution framework was in a folder she had moved to her personal archive drive, where it had not been opened since the day she had set it on the arm of the chair. The marriage registration certificate was in a different folder, the one she had labeled with her own name and his name and the date, and that folder she had moved to a location she accessed more frequently, which was the kind of organizational decision that did not require analysis to understand. She had told exactly one person about all of this, her colleague Petra, who had listened to the full account and had said, "You filed a folder containing your marriage certificate in your daily documents, and a folder containing your divorce draft in your archive, and you did this without noticing what you were doing." And Vivian had said, "I noticed afterward," and Petra had said, "Of course you did," and had not said anything further, which was one of the things Vivian valued most about her. On a Tuesday evening in March, which was a different season from November and a different version of the city she had been moving through for 4 months, she was in the passenger seat of Noel's car on the way back from a dinner that was neither a marsh dinner nor an event she had coordinated, but simply a dinner that 2 people had decided to have, and she was looking at the city going past the window, and he said, "What are you thinking about?" She said, "Nothing specific." He said, "That is not true." She said, "It is true. I am thinking about nothing specific, which is different from thinking about nothing. I am thinking about the city. I am thinking about the fact that March smells different from November. I am thinking that I have been in this car many times, and this is the first time I have not been thinking about work." He said, "Is that strange?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Good, strange, or bad strange?" She said, "I will tell you when I have more data." He said, "That is the most honest answer you have given me in 4 months." She said, "I am working on the output rate." He said, "I know." And they were quiet for the rest of the drive, not the managed quiet of 2 professionals in a car returning from an event, and not the tense quiet of 2 people who had said something significant and did not know what to do with it, but simply the quiet of 2 people in a car in March, in a city that smelled different from November, and it was unremarkable, and it was entirely sufficient.